Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this Techstrong learning experience brought to you by Cerby. My name is Cody, and I'd love to welcome you back. We have an exciting program ahead, but before we get things kicked off, we do have just a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review. First off, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch or maybe share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude this live session today. If you'd like to engage with us, there are a couple of options for you to do so. First option is the chat tab, which it looks like some of you have found. That chat tab is on the right side of your screen, and I'd like you to go ahead and start testing that function out for us right now by letting us know from where in the world you are tuning in. Now, if you have any specific questions, we would like you to send those into the Q&A tab directly to the right of where it says chat. Sending your questions to the Q&A helps us keep track, and we'd love to answer as many of your questions as we can today, so be sure to send them in. If you jump over to where it says handouts, you will see there is a resource there for you, so feel free to grab that. And of course, before we close out today, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around for the duration of our conversation. Alrighty, so the topic of our conversation today is uncovering the hidden cybersecurity threat in your organization. And I'm joined by Matthew Chiodi, Chief Trust Officer at Cerby. Matthew, thank you so much for joining me today. Would you like to go ahead and take it away from here?
Absolutely. Thank you, Cody, for that introduction. So for those of you who don't know me, I am currently the Chief Trust Officer at Cerby. A lot of people ask, what does that mean? What does a Chief Trust Officer mean? If you want to know the answer to it, Google it. I'm just kidding. No, great question. Trust has all things to do with cybersecurity, as well as making sure that in the products that we build at Cerby, that we are using truth in messaging as well. And so what we're going to cover today is a topic that I am really excited about. And as Cody mentioned, if you have questions as I go through this, feel free to pop those into the Q&A, and I will try to answer those in near real time. Can't guarantee real time, but if you're like me, if you try to wait to the end, you'll probably forget your questions. So as you have them, just drop them in the Q&A, and I will answer them as we go along. So what we're going to talk about is a risk that we are attempting to bring to light, and that is the topic of non-federated applications. And I will get to define what those are here in a minute, but I want to start off with just the statistic from this research that really shocked me. And that's this, that 1 in 7 incidents are from applications that can't be managed with your identity provider. I'll say that again. 1 in 7 incidents start in applications that you can't manage with your identity provider. So just to kind of tease you a little bit with that statistic, that is what we're going to talk about. Now let's put a little bit of a definition on what I mean by non-federated applications. Now, some of you, if you come from an identity and access management background, or if you've spent any time working with things like Active Directory, I think many of you probably have, you'll recognize the term federation, right? It typically refers to a grouping of systems. Maybe you might think in terms of ADFS. But what I'm talking about here, when I say an application that's non-federated, I'm talking about applications that specifically lack support for key identity standards. And which are those identity standards? None other than SAML, OIDC, and SCIM. Now, again, depending on your level of familiarity with identity standards, SCIM stands for the System for Cross Identity Management. And typically, SCIM is used for provisioning and deprovisioning automatically via API. So that is the scope of what we're going to talk about here over the next 30 to 40 minutes is non-federated applications, but specifically how they are most likely a hidden threat in your organization. Now, I'm going to give you just a quick snapshot of some common non-federated applications. If you look across these, you'll notice, first of all, most of these are SaaS-based, but I don't want you to get the impression that non-federated apps are only in the cloud. That would be false. In fact, non-federated applications exist across the application spectrum. So they could be on-prem, they could be in the cloud, they could be IT, OT. They are across the board. And they're not just legacy or heritage applications. Certainly for many organizations, their legacy apps don't support modern authentication standards. But the point being, and you'll see this as I begin to go through the research, that non-federated applications cut across all categories from financial to healthcare to utilities, all across the spectrum. Now, before we set out to do this research with the Ponemon Institute, there was some research that we had done at Cerby on our own. And this is just kind of showing you what we found when we looked at the top 10,000 SaaS applications. We were shocked, right? So I won't go through all these statistics, but let's talk about the ones that I think are really pertinent. And that's this: 61% of the top 10,000 SaaS applications don't support the standards necessary to support single sign-on. 61%. Now, I know a lot of times when I talk with customers or with an audience, if they're heavy in identity and access management, they'll say, yeah, I actually think that number's higher. They think it's like 80% that don't support the standards for single sign-on. But this is what we found: about 61%. So over half of applications, and mind you, these are SaaS apps. These are not legacy apps. A lot of times people think, well, hey, if I go out and I buy a SaaS application, it's going to be modern. It's going to support all the protocols and standards. That's just not true. 61% of the time, they don't support those standards. Now, I mentioned SCIM before, the System for Cross-Identity Management. 94% of the top 10,000 SaaS apps don't support SCIM. That is massive. Now, if my memory serves me correctly, the first version of SAML, or the Security Assertion Markup Language, which is usually associated with single sign-on, that came out almost 2 decades ago, SAML v1. It only has, and 61% of apps don't support that standard. When it comes to SCIM, I believe the first version of that came out in 2011. So again, over a decade, both of these standards have been out, and they have this low risk, this low rate of take up. So the point is just because there is a standard, it doesn't necessarily mean that developers or vendors are going to build toward that standard. And that's why there is such a risk with non-federated applications. So when we set out to do this research, we had a couple specific goals in mind. Number one is we knew that if an application falls into the non-federated category, there's likely to be some type of financial impact to the organization. And so what we wanted to quantify was, what is that financial impact? How big is it? Is it significant? Is it insignificant? We wanted to understand that, especially as we head into, at least possibly here in the United States, what could be a recession. This is the thing that many organizations that I speak with, they are concerned with. They're looking for ways that they can reduce their budgets, the way they can be more efficient. And so that's part one. Part one was quantify the impact, both of the manual effort that may go into managing these apps because they're not able to be managed with your identity provider, but also what are the dollars around if there are breaches that stem from these non-federated applications. The second part has to do with quantifying the actionable cyber risks. Now, it would seem obvious that if I have an application that doesn't support an identity standard like SCIM or like SAML, that would then mean that the application itself, the only way that you could log into it is via a manual or standard username and password. And that would be a higher risk, right? Because you could have password reuse, all these types of issues. And so we wanted to quantify that. What are the actual cyber risks rather than just guessing or hypothesizing? And last but not least, we wanted to understand the behaviors organizationally of how these applications may or may not fit in an environment. So with this kind of context in mind, This is what we set out to achieve. And for the study, we did use the Ponemon Institute. Maybe for those of you who aren't familiar with the Ponemon Institute, Dr. Larry Ponemon founded this well over 20 years ago, and they are very well known in the cybersecurity industry for producing reports such as IBM's cost of a data breach, as well as many others. So that's who we chose to work with in order to conduct this research. I always tell people, when you're looking at research, it's important to understand the methodology behind it. Who were they asking? What was the sample size? And so for transparency perspective, I always tell people, if you see a statistic and maybe it's shocking, go and turn to the back of the report and look for the methodology, because you can skew things as a researcher depending upon who you ask. So just for transparency perspective, this is really important. Our sample frame was just under 16,000 IT and security practitioners. Those are those that we sent the request out to. We had almost 700 come back, and then weeding out those who are maybe not closely involved in their organization's identity and access management strategy, we ended up with just under 600 in our final sample size. And again, these are individuals who are involved in their organization's identity and access management strategy. In terms of the industries represented, this was very happy with the way the results came back. As you can see here, financial services is the most heavily represented. But if you look at just these top 10, this is a very wide swath of industries. So as we get into the research here in a minute, I think you'll see that this is something that is very well represented. And quite frankly, if any one of you, I'm sure you would probably fit into any one of these categories. And by the way, if you go into the handouts, I don't remember if this was mentioned at the beginning, if you go into the handout section of your browser, you will see that we actually have a full copy of the report there, and you can look into all the industries and those things. So what did we find? And I don't know if this comes through very well on your monitor, but I've been told by a number of people that they found this image very shocking, right? With this wolf lurking in the background. But I think this is a good visual for what most organizations have in terms of the threat of non-federated applications. So let's get into what we found. The research shows that generally speaking, and obviously some of this is generalized, that organizations or businesses tend to have 3 different types of applications in their environment. The first would be what we call sanctioned applications, and you may call them something different at your organization. But a sanctioned application, and I've got some cloud-based ones here, but again, they could be on-premise apps, they could be homegrown apps as well. The point is, with a sanctioned app, this is an application that is sanctioned and managed by IT and security. They support all the standards. They support SAML, SCIM, all the different standards. They have APIs. This is category 1. These are well managed, and the risk around these apps is generally well understood. The next category is what I would call tolerated, or maybe these are ones that are just called accepted. These tolerated are apps that are sanctioned by IT and security, but they are largely left unmanaged because they don't have the necessary standards behind them so they can be managed at scale. So for example, if you maybe use Okta as your identity provider, you have this app, but you can't manage it with Okta because the app itself doesn't support the necessary standards. So again, these are apps that IT and security know about. They're not shadow apps, but they just can't be managed at scale using the company's tools like Azure AD, Okta, Ping, SailPoint, etc. The next category is what I would call unsanctioned applications. Now, unsanctioned applications, these are apps that are both unsanctioned and they're unmanaged due to users simply growing impatient and waiting. Now, you could say that a part of these unsanctioned apps could be called shadow IT, but the point here that I would say that is different from shadow IT to just something that is maybe just unsanctioned is that Shadow IT can really refer to any application. So for example, maybe your organization is a Microsoft 365 shop, and you have a business unit that goes out for whatever reason, and they start to use Google Workspace for their email. I don't know why someone would do that. But so in that case, Google Workspace would be Shadow IT. But it doesn't mean it's non-federated, right? Because Google Workspace supports all the standards. Point being is that there are some shades of gray here. Now, I have a poll question, and I'd love to get your feedback. When you think about your business, and you think about the different types of applications you have, I'd be curious, where do you think the bulk of your non-federated apps fall into? Do they fall into the tolerated category? Do they fall into the unsanctioned category? Is it a mix of both tolerated and unsanctioned? So if you see that poll, go ahead and answer that. I'd love to see where it is from an audience perspective. Where does it fit? Now, remember, sanctioned applications, not part of this question, but sanctioned are the ones they support all the standards, and they're known and they're loved by IT and security. Tolerated, these are applications that lack support for standards. Maybe you have them. In fact, I know I've been at many companies where we've had a lot of applications that would fall into the tolerated category, but we just couldn't manage them with our IDP. And then we had a lot of unsanctioned as well. These are could be shadow IT, could be other categories. Where do yours fit? Do they fall in tolerated? Do they fall in unsanctioned? Is it a mix of both? All right, we'll let that continue to come up here, and we'll let people continue to answer that question. Now, here's where it gets interesting. When we look at, and this is where we started, when we look at where breaches are starting, we know that they are coming not from an insignificant percentage, but they are coming from this non-federated category. And non-federated apps can fall both tolerated or unsanctioned. This is where that 1 out of 7 statistic comes from. 1 out of 7 breaches begin in applications that you can't manage with your identity provider. All right, so let's think about this. Let's think about this. 1 out of 7. Okay, if you can figure out the percentage there. If 1 out of 7 of breaches begin in apps that you can't manage with your identity provider, how do you solve this problem? And we'll get to that in just a minute. Let's look at this from another perspective. When it comes to these non-federated applications, we ask the question, and again, this comes back to trying to better understand the behaviors organizationally and where the risks are coming from. We ask the question, where are your non-federated apps? Who is managing those in your organization? Is it a business unit? Is it an IT team? Or is it a security and identity team? Who manages access to your non-federated applications in your organization? Where is it coming from? And I actually have a poll for us here that we can take on this, just to kind of see where our group here falls. Now, I can tell you what the research shows is that the majority, 63%, came back and said that their non-federated apps are being managed in the business units. Now, think about the security impact here. If you have a non-federated application, which again is an app that can't be managed with your identity provider, and 63% of them are being managed by the business unit, there are security impacts here. Think about it. A business unit, they know their area of the business. And we know that there's a lot of business units that have specific applications. Think about manufacturing, think about marketing tools like different social media platforms. If 63% of these non-federated apps are being managed by a business unit, these are individuals that don't have security as their primary responsibility. So that means that these apps, more than likely, are not being managed in a way that follows security best practices. And as you'll see, as we go through the research, it begins to show itself. Now, when we look at IT teams, 54%, 45% by security and identity teams, you can see that there is a mix here, but the majority are not having the access to these non-federated apps being managed by IT or security or identity teams. So there are risks. All right, let's look at this from another perspective. When we look at how a security team is not only managing it, but basically we ask the question, okay, if you have non-federated applications, which most organizations do, and we ask the question, how are you keeping track of your non-federated applications? And as you can see here, the responses came back, and I found these very interesting. We'll go through a couple of these, and I'll point out why I say I find them interesting. Now, from my perspective, what these 4 different answers show is that for the most part, teams are really taking a trust and do not verify approach. Think about it. So 62%, the majority of respondents came back and they said that, well, we just rely upon the business unit to self-report their use of non-federated applications. That means that 62% of the time, at least in these organizations, they are not, the security team or the IT team is not being proactive in terms of going out and trying to actually find these applications. They are relying upon a user to self-report. So in this case here, there's a differentiation. There's no proactivity on the part of the security and the IT team. They are hoping that business units self-report their non-federated applications. And now, if you look at the bottom of your screen, skipping to the statistic on the bottom, 39% said that business units complete a form to confirm the use of non-federated applications. So what this implies is that at least this security team or whoever filled this out of these 600 or so respondents has at least proactively thought to say to have some kind of form, maybe in something like a ServiceNow, to be able to say, hey, let's at least try to track these in some way. But that was the lowest percentage. Only 39% said that they had that. All right. Last but not least, so we won't cover each one of these, but 48% said they use a cloud access security broker or a CASB to do it. Now, there are challenges, and I applaud organizations that are at least trying to be proactive. A CASB, those are typically used to identify SaaS-based or cloud-based applications. And they may be able to help you identify rogue SaaS app use or just SaaS app use in general. But where they will likely struggle is in identifying if the app supports the standards like SAML and SCIM or have security APIs. The other thing with the CASB is that even if it could tell you which of the apps that are being used are non-federated or not, CASBs are typically used for detection. They can't actually help you fix or address the problem. So think about it from that perspective. And this is another good place for our third to last question here around it is, how do you keep track of, or do you keep track of non-federated apps in a risk register? You'll see we have a question here coming up on that. But what does that look like for your organization? Do you actually keep track of it? Do you track it at all? Do you wish you were tracking it? What does it look like for your organization? Are you keeping track of it at all? Let's see. We'll cover some of these here in a minute. All right, let's look at this from another angle. One of the things that we wanted to better understand when it came to this risk was, is there a disconnect between security leaders and those that are actually doing identity and access management on a day-to-day basis? We see this with a lot of things where leadership thinks one thing, and then the individual contributors think another, or maybe see another. And so with this question here, we sought to really find out if this was something that was on leadership's radar. And what we found is that this is a risk that security and IT leaders are not yet tracking. And that's evidenced by these responses. 44%, so almost half of those surveyed came back and said that, yeah, my management or my leadership really underestimates the risks of non-federated applications. 44%. The other 34% came back and said, yet, from an organizational perspective, our organization really doesn't make the security of non-federated apps a priority. That's 34%. And so I think that the takeaway from this statistic for me was that this is a real opportunity for maybe those of us that are, that if you're listening, watching this, whether live or later, this could be an opportunity to lead up. I can tell you from a security leadership perspective, leaders are usually looking, they want to make sure that they're aware of maybe not all the risks, but those risks that are a high probability risk, they want to have those on the radar. So this is an opportunity for you to lead upwards in your career. Going back to the previous poll, we asked, do you keep track of non-federated apps in a risk register? Just a tie here. 26% said yes. We just broke the tie. 30% said no, they don't. 6 said, yeah, I wish. And 3 came back and said, yeah, let's not answer this question. The takeaway is that I think even from our small sample group that we have listening live here is that the risk of non-federated apps, it's not really being tracked yet. And obviously our hope with the research is to elevate this risk so it doesn't become an incident in organizations. Now, speaking of incidents, they are happening. This gets to the second part of the research where we wanted to find out just, okay, we understand there are some financial impacts. I'll cover those here in a minute. We know that there are cyber risks, but let's actually quantify it. Is it leading to incidents? Are specifically non-federated apps leading to incidents? And sure enough, it came back that over half of those surveyed, 52%, said that they have experienced an incident specifically from non-federated applications. Over half. So this was probably one of the biggest takeaways that I saw, in that organizations, yes, they have non-federated apps, but they're also having incidents that stem from these applications. And it's not just like one. We found that over 63% of those surveyed had a minimum of 4 incidents or more than 5 incidents from non-federated applications. So incidents from these, they are prevalent. They're not one-time events. These are incidents that are happening, and most organizations have had more than 5 of these. And so this isn't just a risk that could happen. This is a risk that is happening and is real for many organizations. And of course, there are costs, right? If you have an incident, there is almost always a cost associated with it. With this, what we found out was that organizations are spending annually almost 5,000 hours per year remediating and investigating incidents related to non-federated applications. Almost 5,000. Now, if you break that down on a monthly basis, that's about 390 hours per month. 390 hours per month. Think about what you could do as an organization if you could get that time back. What if you didn't have to spend that? Even if you think that number, you might think, well, maybe you're in a small and medium-sized business. Maybe you think that that's a massive number. Even if you cut that number in half and you said it was 150 hours, what could you do with 150 hours of staff time back every year without having to do this? Because when you think about it, the cost, what we found, it costs about $300,000 per year to investigate and remediate. Now, if you're a multinational, you might think, 300 grand, that's like what we make in 5 minutes or a minute. But if you're a small and medium business, this cost is significant. So this is somewhat of a sliding scale. So don't just look at this dollar amount and think, we're a massive organization, we can handle that cost. This is a sliding scale, right? Obviously, it represents the organizations that took this. But if you're a multinational, your cost is going to be much, much higher. And if you're in a small and medium business, you're looking at that $300,000 a year and you're thinking, man, I would love to have that back in my budget. Wow. Looking at this one other way, we looked at this to try to understand this from not, this is, now looking outside of cyber risk, and it's looking at it from how do we potentially recover costs in terms of manual work that humans should not be doing, right? There's a lot of talk about generative AI, how it's going to take over jobs. But here, we're not even talking about that. We're just talking about manual work that needs to be done because an application doesn't support the necessary APIs or standards. In this case, it's usually SCIM that handles automated onboarding and offboarding. So if you think about it this way, this is the way SCIM usually works. If you have an HR system, think of maybe if you're using something like an SAP, or maybe you're using something like Workday. Your first day of work, Jane is provisioned access in a system. That HR system talks to your identity provider. Your identity provider creates an account. And then what it's supposed to happen is when Jane gets added to certain groups or roles, she should be automatically provisioned access in all those downstream applications. But if the application doesn't support SCIM, and we know that over 90% of the time they don't, then a human has to go out and manually add that access. Or when Jane leaves, someone has to go manually out and find all those places that she had access. So we know that the manual work is expensive. In terms of the quantity, we found that the median number of non-federated applications organizations had was about 176. Now, this being the median, the middle, we know that there were organizations that had in excess of 1,000 of these applications. 1,000. These are non-federated apps, but the median is 176. So let's build this out. What does the math look like? So if an organization has 176, what we found is that on average, there's about 8 people in an organization that touch a user during the onboarding and the offboarding process. These are people that have to be involved. Usually it's more because, again, the app's non-federated. Okay, so 176, 8 people involved. And in terms of calculating this, and if you look at the report, you'll see that Ponemon used from data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. What we found is that the manual onboarding and offboarding costs come to right around $1,000 per year per employee. So that number will scale. So the way you can figure out the cost for your organization would be just to look at, okay, if we've got this many headcount, how many contractors and employees onboard every year and how many offboard? And then you can just calculate it by this 1,000 number, and you will very quickly see that there is a hard cost associated with it. In this case here, for our sample group, we found that the total annual cost is around $650K per year. Again, this is manual work that could likely be applied to better things. Now, what I'm not saying is that you can recover all 650,000 of this with automation, but you can potentially recover a large portion of it with automation. So I'm going to pop up the last poll question for today. And that question is if you had to guess, I know that you don't have hard numbers in front of you, but if you had to guess, how many non-federated applications do you have in your environment? And this is just, some mental math here. Think about it from a ballpark perspective. Do you have between 0 and 25? Is it between 26 and 75, 76 to 125, or more than 126? I'm really curious to see our response within our sample group here. We know that, again, the median number from our sample group in the report was about 176. And so I'm curious to see here. We'll leave this poll run for a couple minutes, and then I'll kind of come back to it here in a couple minutes. But if you have to see that poll, go ahead and answer it. I'm kind of curious to see where our responses come in from our survey here. All right. So you're probably thinking, all right, I get it. Non-federated applications, they're a risk. What do I do about it? And I love this picture because I think everyone can identify with it. I'm not going to go into details, but everyone can identify this with this picture. So don't panic is the takeaway. I'm going to give you a couple things that you can do to address this. And then I will leave you at the end with specific action steps that you can take over the next 30, 60, and 90 days. So when you think about it, and just to familiarize yourself with this slide, because there's a lot of stuff going on here. There are really, let's look at it through these two different buckets. On the left-hand side of your screen, you've got your standards supporting apps. These are all the apps. These are the sanctioned ones. And I've got here again a couple of very well-known SaaS apps. But again, these could be IT, OT, on-premise, heritage/legacy apps, any one of those. And those apps, they all work with your workforce identity provider today, right? There's not an issue. But when you think about the apps on the right-hand side of your screen, these are the non-federated, or maybe we want to call them unmanageable applications. The gap that you need to close really fall into these distinct three areas. And so let's talk about it from an authentication perspective, or auth-n. Think about these apps. If an app doesn't support SAML or OIDC, it can't do single sign-on. So you have apps where you have a user who's managing usually their own username and password. These are apps without SAML. They can't do SSO. So think about it. Like if you want to add on two-factor authentication to those accounts, you can't enforce that centrally through your identity provider. That's a gap that you need to close. And this could even likely, for many of you, if you're in a regulated industry like healthcare, finance, and others, you may be out of compliance with certain standards that require two-factor authentication. That's one example. From an authorization perspective, or an auth-z perspective, think about provisioning and deprovisioning. Because an app doesn't support SCIM, you are having to go out and manually provision and deprovision access. And so that's something that you've got to cover. And this is, again, we talked about some of the costs from it. Last is what I would call posture management tasks. So if you have, again, an application that doesn't support the standards, think about it if it's like a shared account. And a lot of times we have shared accounts, maybe they're privileged accounts. Maybe they are, let's think about something we've been talking a lot about, SaaS. But think about, for example, the root administrator account to your 365 tenant or to your Slack tenant. Multiple people usually need access to that. But a posture management task is regularly rotating that password. Without some kind of centralized system, you have to do that manually. So you've got to solve for, with your non-federated apps, you've got to solve for all of these different use cases across these three different categories. And the best way to identify these apps, because part of you, I know from our questions, that not everyone is actively tracking these. And so what I often get asked is, well, how do I begin to identify these apps in our environment? And there's a couple questions that I think will make it really clear. Number one is find the apps in your environment that users are logging in with a separate username and password, right? They're not using their corporate SSO, their corporate IDP credentials. That app is a non-federated app. And I know that we all have them. And again, I want to just be really clear on this. Non-federated apps, they fall across the spectrum. They're not just SaaS. It's not just legacy. A lot of IT and a lot of OT apps fall into this category where there's a username and password. It's not connected to your AD. It's not connected to your IDP. So that's the first question. Do you have users logging with a separate username and password? That's a non-federated app. The next category is, are there applications where users have to be manually onboarded and offboarded? That is a non-federated application. Do you have users that are sharing a single identity or an account? And I know that from a best practices perspective in security, generally we don't like shared accounts, and we shouldn't, right? Because generally you don't know who's logging into that account. You don't know what they're doing with it. It's difficult to do attribution. But the truth is that these shared accounts have legitimate business uses. Again, it could be an administrator account. It could be maybe in your marketing organization and their MarTech stack. Think about all your corporate social media handles that your marketing and PR team have. All those, the Instagram accounts, the LinkedIn, the Facebook Business Manager, all of those are legitimate business use, and they are all shared accounts. Yes, corporate use of social media, those are all non-federated applications, and they have legitimate business uses. Do you have to harass users in certain apps to turn on 2FA, right? You can't do it manually. These are non-federated apps. And lastly, if there's any accounts where you have to manually go out and rotate passwords when employees leave, these are non-federated applications. So in order to holistically address the solution, or rather to find a solution, you've got to have a holistic approach to doing it. So you would need a solution that really does four things. One, you have to be able to detect these applications, both on-prem and in the cloud. And not just detecting them, but when you do detect them, you need a capability to be able to nudge users towards existing applications. So think about it this way. A user goes and signs up for a new subscription to some type of SaaS application. Maybe it's a marketing application. What if you could stop them in real time and say, hey, we already have this one that's corporate approved? That way, you're not creating anything new and you're putting them to new subscriptions. So that would be the first one. You want to be able to detect them and nudge them towards the right subscriptions. The second part of the solution, in order to be able to address this holistically, would be to extend all of the capabilities that are in your existing identity provider, whether it's Azure AD, Okta, SailPoint, you name it, being able to make sure that your IDP has complete coverage across all your apps, not just the ones that support standards. So the ability to extend those IDP capabilities is critical. The third area is in terms of automation. We talked about the onboarding and offboarding and all of the wasted human hours that are involved with doing it. So you would need something that automates all those tasks in terms of posture management, rotating passwords, etc. And last but not least, being able to report back all that activity into some type of centralized system via a SIM or some type of SOAR platform. Because think about it. Non-federated applications, generally speaking, if someone's logging in, they're doing things, all that audit trail is usually held within that application. You're not going to see it in your IDP, and it's highly likely that you're not going to see it back in your SIM tools. So you would need something that supports and addresses all four of these areas. Now, I promise this is really the only sales slide in the whole presentation. And then we'll finish here after this with some very direct action steps that you can take. As promised at the beginning, I try to keep all presentations 99% focused on education. So where does Cerby fit in? So Cerby, what we are focused in is providing access management for your non-federated applications. And we complement your existing identity provider. It doesn't matter which one of the major providers you use. And if you think of it across these three spectrums, authentication, authorization, and governance, your existing IDP is great from an authentication perspective if the app itself supports standards. But if it doesn't, you really can't use it. And that's where Cerby comes in. Cerby extends single sign-on and passwordless authentication capabilities to any app, regardless of its underlying protocols or APIs. So that's one area. The second area is on the area of authorization, or Auth-Z. Again, if your identity providers, they are great when the apps expose underlying security APIs, but where security comes in is if those applications, those non-federated apps that may not expose any APIs at all, whether it's a legacy app or a heritage app on premise, whether it's an IT or OT app, Cerby gets in, extends all those workflows that maybe you've built out in your IDP to any app, regardless of its support for federation standards or for authentication standards. Last but not least, if you have, from a governance perspective, think about it in terms of the lack of visibility. And we touched on this just briefly. Cerby provides comprehensive activity logging for any app that you connect to Cerby. All right, so let's summarize all of this. How can you apply what you've learned today? All right, number one, this week, if you go to the handout section of this interface that you're on here, you will see in there the full copy of the Ponemon research. I'll say that it is an extensive report, in today's talk, we only covered probably less than 20% of what's in there. I encourage you, click on handouts, download that report, set time in your calendar this week to go through it and read it. You probably need a good half hour to really understand and kind of go through what's in the report. So that's this week. Next week, over the next 30 days, here's a very clear-cut use case. Reach out to your marketing team and just ask them, don't point a finger, and just say, hey, I'm curious, like, how are we managing access to our corporate social media accounts? And I can almost guarantee you're going to get like a sheepish response because they're probably sharing the username and password, and they likely have two-factor authentication turned off. And they're probably sharing it with third parties. Most companies don't manage their own social presence. It's usually a third-party agency. So that's a really kind of clear-cut use case where you can begin to identify non-federated, unmanageable applications in your environment. And then over the next 30 days, you can continue to do that. Talk with different business owners about how access is managed. Again, if you're in a consumer products business or business that has a manufacturing component, you will have to go out and begin to talk to those business owners to identify these applications. And then over the next 90 days, you can begin to add these non-federated apps to your risk register. And we know, again, based upon our research here, that most of us here, I think it was 33% responded and said, you wish you were tracking these in your risk register. This is your opportunity to be able to begin tracking that and changing it. Because we all know that once a risk is in the risk register, that begins the process of starting to build the business case for the investment around managing that risk. So this is what I would encourage you to do. And then as you start to build that risk register around non-federated apps, you can start looking at processes and solutions like Cerby that can help you extend your IDP to manage the risks of non-federated applications. All right, so that was my last slide. Now, only one question came in. If you have other questions, feel free to ask those now. And I think this was a general question that came in at the beginning, but it basically said that, cyber threats are constantly evolving. New attack techniques, vulnerabilities emerge. Like, how do you stay updated on the latest threat intelligence? And this is a great question. So in my previous role, I actually ran threat intelligence at Palo Alto Networks, their Unit 42 group. And I would encourage you that if you've not read or seen Unit 42 at Palo Alto, you can just go to unit42.paloaltonetworks.com and you can read all their latest research. I think that organization is probably top 3 threat research in the world. Also, Cisco's Talos Labs is also a great place to stay up to date on threat intelligence. Most of them have an RSS feed that you can subscribe to. So that's what I usually do. I just have a little tab in my browser and, spend, a couple hours a week just staying on top of those threats. I also, one other thing I would recommend is I like the unsupervised learning newsletter. It's the only one of, maybe 3 newsletters that I actually pay for. There's a free version of it, but it's called Unsupervised Learning. Daniel Meisler does that and does a really nice job of just threats and really humanizing some of those things. So that's how I do it. Also, I have a podcast. You can check that out at cloudsecuritytoday.com. Again, it's cloudsecuritytoday.com, where on a monthly basis, I interview guests. And quite frankly, doing a podcast is a great thing because it keeps me up to date. It's also a way to help educate the whole cybersecurity market on issues around cloud security. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you for joining the webcast today. Feel free to reach out. If you have other questions, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. That's usually the place where I am most active. If you want to learn more, you can visit us at cerby.com. That's CERBY, cerby.com.
Awesome, Matt. Thank you so much for that. It does look like we didn't, you're right. It looks like we did not receive any questions. So we're just going to go ahead and give away a couple of gift cards. But if anybody does, sorry about that, Matt, I kicked you off on accident. If anyone does happen to have any last second questions, go ahead and send them in and we might have time for one more. But I would like to remind everyone that the session was recorded. So following this panel, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also find the recording living on Security Boulevard website at securityboulevard.com/webinars. And be sure to look in the on-demand section where it will be waiting for you. The 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing, they are Patty Z, Pierce O, Regina M, and Kirsten K. So to our 4 winners, keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. It should make its way to you in about the next 48 hours. But if you don't happen to see that email, check your spam folder just in case it happens to get filtered out. I'd like to thank Cerby for sponsoring our program today. And to everyone who is here with us, thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate and value your time, and we also really appreciate your feedback. So as soon as we close out, there will be a survey that pops up, and we would love to hear your thoughts about our program, whether it be about today or if you have any suggestions for an upcoming topic. We would love to hear your feedback. Either way, we do hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day. And Matthew, thanks so much for joining us.